Sharon Osbourne, the fiery judge of The X Factor, the unforgettable voice of the Osbournes, the woman who carried a kingdom of chaos on her shoulders and never let it fall, was once thought to be unbreakable. She was the strategist behind the legend, the iron backbone of rock, the flamekeeper who held Ozzy Osbourne's hand through addiction, betrayal, and endless battles with illness. For decades, she braved every storm, cancer, scandals, heartbreak, and when Ozzy passed away, the world believed that was the final cruel blow fate could deliver. But no, at 72, another storm has risen, fiercer still, seeming determined to drain the last embers of fire from the heart of the woman who once defied fate itself. Before we begin, if Ozzy and Sharon remain in your heart, don't forget to leave a like and a heart symbol below this video, a tribute to the couple who lived, loved, and fought until the very end. The first sounds that shaped Sharon Osbourne's life were not lullabies. They were slammed doors, shouted orders, and the heartbreaking silence left by a mother who never came home. London, 1952. Sharon Rachel Arden was born into a house where power roared louder than affection. A house run by Don Arden, the formidable music mogul feared by rivals, respected by artists, and merciless inside his own family. Behind those closed doors, everything was contracts, disputes, and discipline so cold it left no room for tenderness. There were no bedtime stories, no arms wrapping her in safety, only the scratch of pens signing deals, the heavy footsteps down polished corridors, and the cruel reminder that love in that house was conditional. Discipline was absolute. But the deepest wound came not from her father's iron rule, but from fate itself. When Sharon was just 6 years old, her mother was suddenly taken in a tragic car accident. One day there were arguments, voices, fleeting moments of comfort. The next day there was silence, a silence that never left her. That loss hollowed her world, ripping away the only softness she had ever known. Sharon would later confess with brutal clarity, in that house there was everything. Power, wealth, connections, but almost nothing that a child truly needed. Safety, gentleness, the freedom to be vulnerable. With her mother gone and her father consumed by the machinery of fame, Sharon learned early that survival meant resilience. She watched desperate artists and ruthless executives pass through her father's office, and she understood long before adulthood that fame always demanded sacrifice. "You had to be tough before you learned how to laugh," she recalled years later, a line that captured not just a memory, but an entire childhood stripped of innocence. By her teenage years in the late 1960s, Sharon carried loneliness like a second skin. While other girls were discovering friendship and first loves, she was studying power, reading rooms, and rehearsing how to hold her ground in a battle that had not yet begun. Her father's shadow loomed over every decision, teaching her both the cost of disobedience and the mechanics of survival in a ruthless world. Their clashes grew so fierce that as she entered adulthood, father and daughter endured years of silence. Yet within this crucible of pain, something extraordinary was being forged. Sharon was not merely a victim of her circumstances. The coldness, the absence, the tragic loss, all hardened into the steel she would one day wield to hold her family together when storms came. She did not crumble under grief. She reshaped herself inside it. Looking back decades later, Sharon admitted the wounds never truly healed, but they gave her a clarity few ever possess. She knew how fragile comfort could be, how quickly love could vanish, how merciless power could become. That knowledge was not a gift. It was a scar. But it was also the foundation of the resilience that defined her life. Her childhood was not painted in bright colors. It was written in shadows, sharpened, by grief and tempered in silence. And from that silence, Sharon Osbourne emerged not broken, but unyielding, a girl forged in cruelty who would one day carry not only her own storms, but the storms of a legend, and never let them collapse. By the late 1970s, at just 27 years, old Sharon Osbourne stood at a crossroads carved from both privilege and pain. She had grown up in the iron halls of her family's music empire, watching contracts sealed in smoke-filled rooms, studying how power was wielded like a weapon. Now she was expected to carry that legacy forward, but Sharon was not content to simply inherit the world she was born into. The very discipline that had once wounded her had also armed her with negotiation skills, an instinct for survival, and a clarity about what she would and would not tolerate. And then came the man who would define the rest of her life, John Michael, Ozzy Osbourne. At 31 years old, he was freshly cast out of Black Sabbath, broken by addiction, mocked as finished, discarded by an industry that had once worshipped his roar. His voice cracked, his hands shook, his eyes were glassy with chaos. Once a god on stage, now treated as a cautionary tale. Sharon saw him not as a fallen star, but as a wounded giant. And in that woundedness, she recognized herself. Their meeting was not just business. It was a collision of two storms, and it demanded a choice that would tear open her family. In Sharon's world, weakness had no place. And when she declared she would stand beside Ozzy, not only as his manager but as his partner, the reaction, inside her own home, was fierce. Father and daughter clashed in a way that felt like war, not over money but over the definition of loyalty. To him, her choice looked like betrayal. To her, it was the first act of true love. Choosing Ozzy meant losing my family, Sharon would later recall. The heartbreak of that admission reveals how merciless the choice was. Blood against love, legacy against destiny, and with that choice came a price too heavy for most to bear. She was cut off from the inheritance she had been raised to expect, stripped of her place in the dynasty, forced to walk away from the protection of a name that had dominated the industry. Sharon knew that from the moment she stood by Ozzy, she was no longer her father's heir. She was an exile, staking everything on a man the world called finished. But Sharon chose, and once she chose, she never looked back. Managing Ozzy in those early years was nothing short of walking a tightrope above chaos. The money was gone, the name was tarnished, the drugs were everywhere, and failure would not only end a career but obliterate the fragile love that was just beginning to grow between them. Sharon mortgaged her future, her safety, even her family ties on the belief that Ozzy could rise again. I felt like the whole world turned its back, and I was betting my soul on one man, she admitted. There were nights when she sat alone in hotel rooms with unpaid bills stacked like tombstones, praying the man she loved would survive long, enough to make it to the next show. And there were mornings when Ozzy himself, ashamed and trembling, whispered years later, "She saved my life when nobody else would even look me in the eye." Still, the ridicule of critics and the crushing weight of her past bore down so cruelly that Sharon confessed, "If this fails, I lose everything." Yet through that fire, she became something more than a manager. She became an architect of resurrection. She designed tours, rebuilt trust with labels, shielded Ozzy from collapse while fighting her own silent battles. And in 1982, when she finally married him, the union was not just a wedding, it was the sealing of a vow written in scars. Sharon had crossed from daughter to exile, from heiress to warrior, from spectator of power to wielder of it. The price she paid was steep, but the love she forged was unbreakable. The Osbourne family was both famous and fragile. Television gave them a microphone but took away their quiet nights. Years later, Ozzy himself admitted it was the worst decision of his life, calling those years miserable. What the world consumed as comedy, the family endured as tragedy. Yet Sharon's candor made her irresistible to the entertainment world. Soon, she was recruited to sit behind the judge's desk. The X Factor UK, America's Got Talent. And here, Sharon's personality exploded into legend. She was fiery, hilarious, brutally honest, but never without heart. Contestants feared her scowl and lived for her rare but radiant praise. She became a face audiences trusted and a voice that cut through the artificiality of the stage. Sharon wrote a best-selling memoir, candid about her battles with cancer, her marriage, and her survival, cementing herself not only as Ozzy's partner, but as a star in her own right. But television is a cruel master. What it gives, it can take away in an instant. By 2010, Sharon had reached a new peak as co-host of The Talk, carving out a daytime throne where her wit and wisdom made her a staple of American living rooms. For more than a decade, she thrived, until 2021 at 68 years old, when one heated, on-air exchange spiraled into scandal. Overnight, Sharon went from trusted matriarch to public villain, accused, dissected, condemned. The backlash was swift and merciless. Social media became a storm of insults, threats, and accusations. The kind of tidal wave that can shatter even the strongest spirit. Sharon, who had once stood toe-to-toe with executives and drug dealers alike, now faced an enemy without a face. Millions of strangers demanding her exile. Contracts evaporated. Sleep vanished. And in interviews years later, her voice trembled, as she admitted that period nearly broke her completely. "I thought my life was over," she whispered, her words heavy with scars. The public often misread her strength as cruelty. They saw the iron judge, the woman unafraid to call a performance, dreadful or a co-host out of line. But behind that armor was a woman who had opened her home, her heart, and ultimately her life to the world, and paid the price of being misunderstood. For every standing ovation, there were nights when Sharon sat alone, scrolling through headlines, that branded her a villain, then slipping into the bathroom so no one could hear her cry. The applause outside felt mocking when the reality inside was loneliness, exhaustion, and the unbearable weight of being turned into a caricature. And yet, she endured. Sharon did what she had always done. She refused to surrender. She walked away from the talk with her head high, vowing never to let scandal define her. She spoke openly about her regrets and her lessons, turning vulnerability into her next act of defiance. And when asked how she found the strength to keep moving forward, Sharon offered no grand speech, only the truth. "You either live in shame or you live in truth. I chose truth." By the time the credits rolled on her years in television, Sharon Osbourne was no longer just the manager of a rock legend or the wife of a superstar. She was a survivor in her own right, a woman who had stood in the brightest spotlight and survived its cruelest burn. She walked through fire not once, but again and again. And when the flames cleared, it was Sharon who still stood, scarred, unbowed, and unbroken. Yet even as Sharon commanded the brightest stages and lived beneath the hottest lights, another battle was being fought in silence, one not against critics or cameras, but against her own body. In 2002, at just 50 years, old Sharon Osbourne heard the words no one ever wants to hear: colon cancer. The diagnosis did not feel like a sentence written in medical charts. It struck like a dagger, sharp and merciless, into a life already stretched thin between boardrooms, hospital corridors, and the chaos of raising a family under the glare of reality television. Chemotherapy hollowed her from the inside out. It stripped her strength until she could barely climb the stairs, drained her skin of its color until mirrors became strangers, left her hair falling in clumps on the pillow like mute reminders of mortality. Her bones ached, her voice trembled, her hands shook. And yet, almost unbelievably, Sharon still stepped into the spotlight. She painted on her wicked grin, cracked biting jokes for the cameras, scolded her children with the fire audiences adored, and projected the image of a woman unshakable. Fans laughed with her, never guessing that moments before filming she had been bent over a sink, wiping tears with trembling fingers, or that beneath her wig lay a scalp raw and tender from the cruelty of treatment. The cruelty was not only physical. Sharon carried with her the ghost of her own childhood, the memory of losing her mother, young, a wound that had never healed. Now, in the darkest hours of chemo nights, that memory returned with a vengeance. She would lie awake in the dim light of her bathroom, whispering through cracked lips, "I can't leave them motherless." Not like I was. That single fear eclipsed her own pain. Cancer could take her body piece by piece, but she would not allow it to take her children's sense of safety. That vow, spoken through clenched teeth, became the anchor that held her upright when her body wanted only to collapse. To the cameras, Sharon Osbourne remained radiant, sharp, almost untouchable. She guided her family through the whirlwind of sudden fame, shielded Ozzy from the terror of imagining life without her, and kept the household orbiting around her strength. But the truth lived behind closed doors. Sharon curled on the bathroom floor, too weak to stand, whispering to herself over and over, "I can't fall apart. Not now." In those days, she was not simply surviving colon cancer, she was defying it. Every step into the studio, every moment of laughter forced through pain, was an act of rebellion against the disease that tried to hollow her life. And in the end, though scarred and trembling, she did what Sharon Osbourne had always done. She rose, not flawless, not unbroken, but unyielding. She chose to rise because breaking was never an option, not when her family depended on her to hold the kingdom together. Fate, however, was merciless. As if Sharon's cancer were not punishment enough, December 2003 struck with cruelty so sharp it seemed designed to break her. Ozzy, the man she had held through every collapse, lay shattered after a near-fatal ATV crash. His collarbone snapped, ribs crushed, chest bruised purple, his breath shallow and erratic. Machines kept the rhythm of life where his own body could not. Sharon herself, tethered to IV lines, her veins burning from chemotherapy, dragged her weakened frame through sterile hospital corridors. Her skin was ghost pale, her hair already gone, her steps unsteady. But at his bedside she planted herself like stone. Her hand, frail and trembling, refused to let go of his. "You're not leaving me. Not now," she whispered, cracked lips barely forming the words. Ozzy, half-conscious, later wept as he admitted, "She saved me when she could barely save herself." Their marriage, never a fairy tale, had become a battlefield signed not in vows and rings, but in blood, scars, and nights spent daring death to take them both. But even as one hand clung to her husband's survival, the other reached desperately for her children. Jack, still barely more than a boy, had surrendered to addiction. While chemo stripped Sharon's body by night, she sat hunched over a phone, at 3 a.m., begging strangers at rehab centers to save her son. Her voice cracked, but she would not stop pleading, "Please take him before it's too late." Jack would later confess, "I thought I was losing myself while my mom was fighting for her life." And then came Kelly. Her daughter's bright laugh was swallowed by pills and alcohol. Her spark dulled into dependency. Sharon, too weak to raise her voice, carried the collapse of her children like another tumor pressing on her chest. In a whisper that was both confession and indictment, she admitted, "Cancer was killing me slowly, but addiction was killing my family faster." The cruelty of it all was unbearable in its irony. Outside, the Osbournes broadcasted chaos as comedy. Viewers laughed at Ozzy's mumbling, Jack's antics, Kelly's sharp tongue, Sharon's fiery scolding. But the cameras never showed the truth. The mother with no hair, veins swollen from chemo, curled on the bathroom floor to vomit between takes. The wife too weak to walk, yet planted for 12 hours beside her broken husband, willing him to breathe. The woman clutching the phone in the dark, begging a clinic to save her child while her own body withered. The world saw entertainment. Sharon was living apocalypse. Still, she endured. To the audience, she was radiant, sharp, unshakable. To her family, she was the final line of defense, a soldier fighting on 3 fronts, against the poison inside her veins, against the fragility of her husband's battered body, against the slow unraveling of her children's lives. Alone, she absorbed every strike, every headline, every whispered fear of collapse. And somehow, impossibly, she stood. Every scar carved into her body, every night of silent tears, every vow of not now whispered into the dark, became part of a testament larger than fame, larger than survival. Ozzy would later say, "She held me together when I was falling apart." Jack, years into recovery, admitted, "She fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself." Kelly, her voice trembling with memory, said, "I thought I lost her, but she never stopped being there, even when she was broken." These were not the accolades of fans or critics. They were the confessions of lives saved by her refusal to collapse. And so, when history recalls Sharon Osbourne, it is not only as Ozzy's flame or a fierce judge on television, it is as the woman who waged war on 3 fronts and refused to surrender. Scarred, pale, trembling, she carried a kingdom. On shoulders weakened by chemo, carried her husband back from the edge of death, carried her children through their darkest spirals. She carried them all, and still she rose. By 2012, Sharon Osbourne had already survived storms that would have destroyed most. Cancer had stolen her strength. Ozzy's near death had scarred her soul. Her children's spirals had nearly broken her heart. But fate was not finished. At 60 years old, doctors told her the words she had feared since her youth. Her genetic history, the shadow that had taken her mother too soon, meant cancer could return at any moment. And this time, it might not be survivable. Sharon did not cry. She did not bargain. With a clarity as sharp as a blade, she chose the path few would dare. She would undergo a preventive double mastectomy. It was not beauty she measured, but life itself. "I didn't do it to look different," she said, her voice steady enough to silence entire rooms. "I did it to stay alive." The operation was brutal, the recovery grueling. When she looked down and saw the scars etched into her chest, they were not just physical wounds, but symbols of a choice that traded vanity for survival, flesh for time, fear for love. Sharon later admitted that what broke her was not the pain, but the thought of her children waking up one day without a mother, just as she once had. "I couldn't leave them motherless," she whispered. "Not like I was." The world, obsessed with perfection, might have expected her to hide. But Sharon never hid. She revealed the truth with unflinching candor. She stood before cameras and confessed what millions of women were too afraid to say, that scars are not shame, they are proof of survival. In doing so, she carried countless others with her, women who saw their own fears reflected in her bravery. But survival carried its own cruel aftermath. Sharon, always honest, admitted that not every decision she made with her body was guided by wisdom. There were cosmetic procedures that betrayed her. She once looked into the mirror and saw not herself, but a stranger, her once expressive face stiff, frozen. "I felt frozen," she said bluntly, her candor stripping away the illusion that fame could protect her from regret. There was also the frightening period when medication carved weight from her body so quickly she seemed to vanish, her once commanding presence shrinking into fragility. Ruthless tabloids turned her pain into spectacle, dissecting her face, her weight, her scars as though suffering were entertainment. What others might have hidden in shame, Sharon dragged into the light. She admitted her mistakes, apologized when choices failed her, and rebuilt herself with the same steel honesty that had carried her through decades of storms. The cruelty she endured was twofold: the physical agony of her body's betrayals and the merciless judgment of millions of strangers. Every scar became a headline, every wrinkle, every accusation, every mistake a weapon. And yet, she endured. She endured because she had learned from childhood that love was fragile and life was merciless. She endured because she refused to let her children carry the silence she once did. She endured because, as Ozzy later said quietly, she saved me. But she also saved herself. Her scars were no longer flaws. They became her crown. A crown not polished in gold but carved in survival. To Jack, she was the mother who fought for him when she could barely stand. To Kelly, she was proof that love does not leave, even when broken. To Ozzy, she was the flame that refused to die. And to herself, she became proof that resilience is not about never falling. It is about falling again and still rising. When Sharon Osbourne stepped back into the light after every operation, every regret, every public humiliation, she did not hide her wounds. She wore them. They were not signs of weakness, but of war survived. They were the proof of a woman who had endured the unimaginable and still stood unbowed. Her scars, once whispers of pain, became her crown of survival. And in that crown, she showed the world that sometimes the greatest act of defiance is not perfection, but survival itself. By 2016, Sharon Osbourne had already survived cancer, surgeries, the chaos of fame, and the endless toll of holding her family together through storms that would have broken others. But nothing prepared her for the wound that cut deepest, the betrayal of the man she had stood beside for more than 3 decades. The day she uncovered Azzy's infidelity, Sharon said it felt like a blade driven into her chest, a wound no surgeon could ever close. For years, she had fought the world to protect him, to rebuild him from ruin, to hold his legend above collapse. And now the collapse came from within her own home. For the first time, she walked away. Their separation was brief, but it was suffocating, a silence soaked with disbelief, grief, and the unbearable sense that decades of love had crumbled overnight. Azzy, later admitting the truth, confessed his actions had nearly destroyed everything they had built. Sharon, devastated but unyielding, refused to let rage or shame dictate her life. Choosing to stay, she later confessed, was not weakness. It was the hardest decision I ever made. To outsiders, leaving might have looked like strength, but to Sharon, staying, confronting the man who had broken her, demanding truth and insisting on change, required far greater courage. The aftermath was brutal. Sharon spiraled into depression, her spirit collapsing beneath the weight of betrayal. Days blurred into nights when she could not summon the strength to rise. When the woman who had stared down cancer and carried an empire on her shoulders now admitted she no longer knew if her marriage could survive. And then came the night that nearly ended it all. The night Sharon truly believed she might not live to see another dawn. Azzy, consumed by illness, addiction, and a darkness he could no longer control, turned on the very woman who had once saved him. Sharon later recalled the terror, her vision narrowing into black, her heartbeat pounding like war drums in her ears, the chilling certainty that this might be the last sound she would ever hear. The room spun, the air was ripped from her lungs, and love, the one force she had clung to all her life, suddenly felt like mortal danger. Seconds stretched into eternities until the wail of sirens pierced the silence like a lifeline. Red and blue lights bled through the windows, shadows flickering across the walls, and then the door burst open. Police rushed in, pulling them apart just before it was too late. That night broke me. Sharon admitted, her voice trembling even years later. But it also forced me to decide if love was stronger than fear. The scars of that night were not only physical. They were etched into her memory, haunting her in flashes, the silence afterward, the thunder of her own heartbeat, the numbness of realizing she had survived something unspeakable. Azy himself, in moments of painful honesty, would later whisper, "I don't remember the rage, but I remember the horror when I realized what I'd done." He confessed with shame that he had become his own worst enemy, acknowledging it was not hatred, but sickness, not cruelty, but chaos, that had consumed him. His admission carried its own truth. Untreated illness and addiction do not only shatter careers, they can endanger the very people we love most. For Sharon, the memory never faded, but neither did the defiance that rose from it. She refused to let that night define her marriage or her life. Instead, she turned it into testimony that survival sometimes means drawing a line, demanding truth, and choosing to rebuild only when both hearts are willing to fight for change. Her resilience was not just personal. It was a message for anyone living in silence, afraid to speak, seek help, name the darkness, break the cycle, and never believe that pain must remain hidden. Shattered and breathless, Sharon told herself the same words she had whispered through every storm. "I will endure this too." Therapy became the fragile bridge between ruin and rebuilding. In rooms filled with silence, tears, and halting words, Sharon and Azy relearned how to sit together, how to breathe together, how to trust. Forgiveness did not come cheaply. "I didn't forgive because I forgot," she explained, her voice raw. "I forgave because I wanted my family to still have a future." That act was not surrender. It was defiance, a refusal to let betrayal be the final chapter. Slowly, something shifted. Azy sought treatment, admitted his failures, and in rare moments of public candor, called Sharon the reason he was still alive. Their bond, fractured and scarred, was reforged in fire. Outsiders asked how she could stay, but Sharon's answer was unwavering. Staying was not weakness. It was survival. It was strength. It was love. Tested beyond recognition, yet still unbroken, this chapter revealed Sharon not as a woman trapped, but as one who turned heartbreak into testament. Her marriage to Azy was never a fairy tale. It was a battlefield. And Sharon Osbourne, scarred but unyielding, proved that sometimes the bravest act of all is not walking away, but standing your ground and daring to rebuild when the world believes all is lost. The fall came in 2019, and with it a storm unlike any Sharon or Azy had ever faced. One slip at home, so ordinary, so cruel, spiraled into a chain of surgeries that left Azy Osbourne, once the unstoppable Prince of Darkness, pinned to hospital beds. Metal rods threaded through his body where music once coursed. Scars lined his skin where tattoos used to speak of rebellion. The roar that had commanded stadiums now gave way to groans echoing through sterile corridors. Sharon, watching from the side, saw not just a husband in pain, but a legend dismantled piece by piece. The man who once leapt across stages before. Tens of thousands could now barely cross a room without collapsing. Nights were filled not with applause, but with muffled cries. Mornings with medical charts instead of tour schedules. Sharon was no longer wife or manager. She became caretaker, nurse, guardian, and silent witness to his unraveling. For Azy, the torment went beyond broken bones. It was humiliation of the soul. "These past 4 years have been nothing but hell," he confessed in interviews, his once thunderous voice cracked by exhaustion. He admitted bitter regret for the surgeries meant to save him. "If I could do it over again, I would never have had them. They took more than they gave back." The spine that had carried him through decades of chaos now betrayed him at every step. For the first time, The greatest danger he faced was not scandal, not addiction, but the quiet, merciless rebellion of his own body. Sharon lived this descent in excruciating detail. She memorized the rhythm of heart monitors, learned the cold, language of painkillers and physiotherapy, and sat through endless hours in waiting rooms where hope felt as thin as hospital gowns. At night, when he clenched his teeth against pain that crawled up his spine, she wrapped her arms around him, knowing she could not stop the torment, but refusing to let him face it alone. She admitted later, "Nothing in all our storms prepared me for this. Not betrayal, not addiction, not even cancer. Watching him suffer was a new kind of agony." And yet, even broken, AZ never let go of remorse. In the dark, he whispered apologies, ashamed that Sharon once again carried him when he could not carry himself. "I'm sorry, Sharon. You didn't sign up for this," he said. She, exhausted but defiant, silenced him with the same fire that had carried them through decades of chaos. We fight this together, or not at all. The world saw headlines about cancellations and delays. What they did not see were the nights when Sharon lifted him into bed as his legs buckled, or when she pressed her forehead against hospital pillows, whispering prayers no one else would ever hear. They did not see AZ staring at his trembling hands that once gripped microphones like weapons, whispering, "My body has betrayed me." For Sharon, these were not merely years of survival. They were years of watching time itself turn traitor. The betrayal was not in newspapers or backstage dramas. It was in bones, nerves, flesh. And yet within that betrayal, Sharon uncovered the deepest truth of love. That being a partner is not only celebrating the roar of stadiums, but holding dignity for someone when they can no longer hold it themselves. In January 2020, the truth could no longer be hidden. AZ Osbourne, the man who had once seemed immortal beneath stadium lights, sat before cameras and whispered the words millions never expected: Parkinson's disease. His hands shook, his voice cracked, and for a fleeting second, the Prince of Darkness looked fragile. But beside him sat Sharon, her posture straight, her eyes fierce, her hand locked over his. If his confession trembled, her presence steadied it. She refused to let the world see only weakness. "This is not the end," her gaze seemed to say. To Sharon, the moment was agony, watching her husband surrender the secret that had haunted their nights. But it was also her defiance. By standing beside him, she transformed his pain into dignity, making sure the world saw not a fallen icon, but a man brave enough to face truth head-on. The announcement was not merely a press conference. It was a crucifixion of pride played out under headlines. Questions multiplied, pity loomed, and speculation threatened to swallow respect. But Sharon absorbed the blows. She became AZ's voice when his faltered, his armor when the world turned cruel, his witness when silence might have erased him. "He's not finished," she declared, sharp enough to cut through doubt. For millions watching, Sharon was not just a wife. She was a shield, demanding that illness would not define the man she loved. And AZ, his voice breaking, admitted later, "I hated that Sharon had to carry my weakness in front of the world, but without her, I would have hidden until it killed me." As if Parkinson's were not punishment enough, the pandemic years struck like another curse. Both Sharon and AZ were caught by COVID. Their bodies, already weakened, now forced into yet another war for survival. Sharon later confessed those nights were some of the darkest of her life. She lay awake, listening to the ragged rasp of AZ's breathing, counting the shallow rise and fall of his chest, her heart pounding with a single unbearable thought: our children could lose us both. Feverish and frail herself, she still dragged her body across the room to lay her hand on his chest, whispering prayers into the silence, bargaining with a universe that seemed determined to strip everything from them. "I wasn't afraid of dying," she admitted. "I was afraid of leaving him alone in the dark." For AZ, the memories of that time still lingered like smoke. "I don't remember the coughing or the fever," he said later, his voice low. "But I remember looking at her and thinking, if she goes, I go too." The man once mocked as indestructible admitted what terrified him most, not death, but life without Sharon. And yet, out of that double storm, Parkinson's and the pandemic, Sharon carved meaning. She refused to let age, disease, or even a global virus strip AZ of his dignity. She turned frailty into testimony, proving that vulnerability could still be strength, that truth could still be a shield, that love could still hold the line when time and sickness conspired to break it. "We are still here," she said after their recovery, her voice both tender and defiant. But what she meant was more profound. That surviving was not only about enduring illness, it was about insisting that even in weakness, there was worth. Even in fragility, there was dignity. And even in the face of mortality, there could still be love. Sharon Osbourne, who had once carried the Prince of Darkness through chaos and addiction, stood once more at his side and showed the world that, even when the body betrays, the soul can still be defended. Their survival in 2020 was a victory, but also a warning. Each passing year stole more from AZ's body, the falls, the surgeries, the endless pain, until Sharon understood a truth, more brutal than any diagnosis. Time would not give him back what it had taken. The only gift she could offer now was not more years, but one last night, a single unforgettable blaze before the darkness closed in. That night came on July 5th, 2025, in Birmingham, the city where it had all begun and where it would now end to the public. It was announced as a concert, but Sharon knew the truth. It was a farewell, a requiem she had built with her own hands. In secret, she carried the weight of decisions no one else dared to name, the risk that his failing spine might give out, under the lights, that his trembling body might betray him mid-song, that a celebration could turn into a tragedy before the eyes of the world. She managed doctors, contracts, security, silence, like a general planning her final battle. But this was not business. It was love sharpened into duty. AZ had begged not to fade in whispers. He wanted to roar one last time, and so she built him not a stage, but an altar. When the lights went down, Sharon's heart nearly stopped. AZ stepped forward, frail in frame but still crowned in defiance. And the first note tore through the air. His voice, cracked yet burning, rose above the roar of tens of thousands. It was not just music, it was defiance of time itself. The crowd screamed, not only in worship, but in mourning, for they, too, knew what Sharon knew. This was the end. Each lyric, each howl was a countdown. In the wings, Sharon clutched her hands until her knuckles bled white, whispering prayers with every line. Just let him finish. Just let him finish. "It wasn't a concert," one crew member said later. "It was a holy rite." For AZ, it was deliverance. For 4 years he had called life hell, had cursed the surgeries that stole his strength, had confessed that his own body felt like a traitor. And now, in Birmingham, he reclaimed himself. "This is all I have left to give," he had whispered to Sharon before walking on stage. And give he did. Every note rang from the marrow of a man who refused to die quietly. For Sharon, the night was agony braided with grace, agony in knowing she had orchestrated her own goodbye, watching her husband burn himself down to embers before her eyes, grace in knowing she had given him the ending he longed for. Not hospital machines, not sterile silence, but thunder, fire, and love. As the final chord crashed, AZ bowed, and the roar that followed was not applause alone. It was elegy, the sound of thousands mourning and celebrating in the same breath. Hidden in the shadows, Sharon's tears fell freely. She had carried him here through betrayal, illness, addiction, surgeries, Parkinson's, and even plague, just to give him this one last roar. It was not a performance. It was a coronation and a funeral all at once. The farewell of a king, and the triumph of the queen who refused to let him go without dignity. The roar that had once shaken stadiums was now reduced to a fragile whisper. In the summer of 2025, A.Z. Osbourne lay frail, his body a shadow of the force it had once been. Every breath seemed borrowed, every word a struggle. Sharon sat vigil at his side, her hand wrapped around his as though her grip alone could anchor him to the world. She had been many things in their decades together, manager, protector, lover, mother, nurse, but now she was simply a wife watching time slip away. The man who had leapt across stages, defied death, and howled into the night. For half a century now, fought to lift a glass of water, his thunderous voice reduced to cracks of silence. Sharon later admitted those nights were the hardest of her life. I wasn't afraid of him dying. I was afraid of him dying alone. She brushed the sweat from his forehead, whispered stories of their children, their grandchildren, their wildest triumphs. Anything to tether him to the life they had built. Some nights he would manage a faint smile, squeeze her hand, and whisper, "You kept me alive longer than I deserved." Other nights he drifted into silence, leaving Sharon with only the sound of machines and her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. To the world outside, he was still the Prince of Darkness. To Sharon, he was simply her husband, slipping further away with each passing hour. The end came not with a scream, but with a silence louder than any concert. In the early hours of July 22, 2025, A.Z.'s breathing grew shallow, his chest rising and falling like fragile glass. Sharon never left his side, her hand clasping his with desperate tenderness. The monitor ticked and faltered, each beep slower than the last. She leaned close, whispering through tears, "You roared until the end, my love. Rest now." His eyes opened once more, meeting hers, heavy with love and surrender. And then, with a final exhale, the sound was gone. Sharon would later describe that silence as unbearable, a stillness that stretched into eternity. For more than 40 years, she had fought every battle at his side. Now, in the one fight she could not win, she felt half her own soul depart with him. When doctors moved to turn off the machines, Sharon pressed her forehead against his and refused to let go. "I will carry you," she whispered, her voice breaking. That night, the Prince of Darkness slipped into history, but Sharon Osbourne became the widow of a legend and the keeper of his fire. The funeral was less a ceremony than a coronation in reverse. On that July day, thousands lined the streets holding candles and wearing black shirts emblazoned with his face. To the world, it was the farewell of a king. To Sharon, it was the loss of her husband, her anchor, her other half. Cameras captured her standing tall beside the coffin, dignified in black, her face unreadable. Yet those nearest saw the tremor in her hands, the way her eyes lingered on the casket, as if she could will it to open just once more. Inside the church, the music that had carried A.Z.'s life played softly, echoing like a requiem. Jack and Kelly clutched each other in grief. Sharon stood at the front, her palm resting on the coffin, lips trembling as she mouthed a silent goodbye. Outside, when the crowd erupted into one last chant, "Ozzy, Ozzy," it shook the air like thunder. Sharon's tears finally broke free. "He wanted to leave with noise," she whispered, "and he did." When the mourners had gone, Sharon remained in the empty hall. She sat alone on the front pew, staring at flowers, photographs, the guitar resting beside the coffin. For the first time in decades, there was no show to run, no crisis to fix, no voice to protect. Only silence, only absence. Later, she confessed, "That was the loneliest moment of my life. The world lost a legend, but I lost my other half. Sharon Osbourne walked out of that funeral not as the manager of a legend, nor as the wife of a rock god, but as the last bearer of their story. She had fought for Ozzy's dignity until his very last breath, and now she carried his legacy on her shoulders alone. The world would remember him as the Prince of Darkness. Sharon would remember him as the man she saved again and again. The man who called her his lifeline. The man who, even in death, left her both broken and unbowed. Her scars had always been her crown. On that day, they became her inheritance, the proof that love, even when shattered by death, can still burn bright enough to light the way forward. The funeral crowds have faded, but the silence they left behind is heavier than any roar. Since Ozzy's passing in late July 2025, Sharon Osbourne has carried herself with dignity in public, but those closest to her know the wound is still raw. Friends whisper that she has grown thinner, her eyes often distant, lost in memories. Nights are the hardest. The side of the bed where Ozzy once lay is now a hollow space, and Sharon admits that the quiet feels unbearable. "I wasn't afraid of sickness," she once said, "but I was never ready for absence." For a woman who had survived cancer, betrayal, and decades of storms, this loss was the first that no resilience could undo. Most days, Sharon remains in Buckinghamshire, the countryside home that once rang with Ozzy's laughter. Jack, Kelly, and Amy visit often, bringing her grandchildren to fill the house with noise that is both balm and reminder. On weekends, Sharon insists on keeping the family ritual of dinner together. They cook simple meals, play old home tapes, sometimes laughing through tears as Ozzy's voice crackles through the speakers. In the garden he once loved, Sharon tends to the flowers, often pausing to whisper, "This was his favorite spot." Work has not disappeared. She still records the Osbournes podcast when she has the strength and quietly oversees projects tied to Ozzy's legacy, from the upcoming biopic to archival releases. But everything moves slower now, at her pace, in a rhythm that makes room for grief. Her health reflects the toll of sorrow. Sharon has spoken openly about struggling with sleep since Ozzy's death. Some nights she walks the garden at dawn because the night feels endless. She eats clean, focusing on greens and proteins. Careful to rebuild her strength, though she admits her appetite is often dulled by grief. Therapy sessions have become part of her routine, not as weakness, but as survival, helping her carry the loneliness that comes in waves. She has stepped back from cosmetic interventions. Her style now is simpler, her beauty less about appearance and more about the quiet aura of someone who has endured. Sharon may look smaller, more fragile, but her presence remains unshaken. And yet, even in mourning, Sharon transforms pain into purpose. The Osbourne estate, estimated by media at over $200 million, now carries a dual mission: to secure her children and grandchildren's future and to give back. Portions will go toward Parkinson's research, children's charities, and music education, what Sharon calls their living legacy. Even the proceeds from Ozzy's final concert in Birmingham, the night he roared for the last time before tens of thousands, were quietly redirected by Sharon. Every pound from that show was funneled into those same causes, turning farewell applause into research grants, hospital support, and instruments for children who might otherwise never touch music. To the public, it had been Ozzy's last concert. In truth, Sharon had made it a covenant of hope. She attends only select public events, usually memorials or tributes, speaking briefly but with piercing clarity. Each time, her words remind audiences that behind every legend stood someone who carried the fire when he could not. "He wanted to leave with noise," she told mourners in July. "Now it is my duty to keep the echo alive." For fans around the world, Sharon's grief is a mirror. She embodies the truth that love does not end with death. It lingers in rituals, in memories. In the silence, we learn to survive. From her life, we learned that resilience is not about never breaking, but about rising, even when broken. That forgiveness is not weakness, but the courage to keep a family alive. And that legacy is not measured in monuments, but in the lives touched along the way. Sharon shows that you cannot outlive pain, but you can outlove it. If Azi's roar taught us how to defy the darkness, Sharon's endurance teaches us how to carry the light when the storm refuses to pass. If her courage has touched your heart, leave a note below. Add your memory, your prayer, your fire, so that together the echo will never fade.